picture.
The diencephalon, let me add a third structure here.
It took a long time to take the picture though. It's like,
Sheesh.
Diencephalon, we're going to talk about the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and just briefly the pineal gland, also known as the pineal body. So this should be familiar to you. We first saw this shape when we were looking at the third ventricle. So the reason there's a hole in our ventricle models is because of this interthalamic mass or intermediate mass, which is a solid structure that touches the other side of the thalamus. There's no actual communication between them. And the cerebrospinal fluid kind of has to flow around that. The thalamus then is above the hypothalamus, which is below. The pineal gland is a growth out of the roof of the third ventricle. Out of the floor of the third ventricle, we see the optic nerve, pituitary gland, and mammillary bodies, which are components of the hypothalamus. All right, so those are all structures that I want you to associate with diencephalon. It's a central structure that's overgrown by the rapid growth of the brain. So the first one we're going to look at is the thalamus, and that's the orange region that you see right here. Found, again, in the midline of the brain, on either side of the third ventricle. It is actually formed of multiple nuclei. Now, when we see it in that midline, a lot of students, including myself, for years I thought that this was just the thalamus, this little round disc was just the thalamus. It's more like two walnut halves. All right, it actually becomes a bit larger posteriorly. And so if this is anterior, this gap between these two structures here is our third ventricle. And this larger region of the thalamus is known as the pulvinar. So it's more than just that one medial surface that we see. Most of these nuclei are sensory nuclei. We talked yesterday about the sensory relay, how sensory neurons come to the thalamus, and from the thalamus they end up in the post-central gyrus or in the primary auditory gyrus. There are a few that are motor that we just talked about with the basal nuclei that are sending activating neurons to the cortex. So on page 78, I list ventral media, anterior, and medial. You do not have to know those and their specific functions. All right, I do want you to know lateral geniculate and medial geniculate. The lateral geniculate and medial geniculate you can see down here as these two bumps. And so what happens, let's see if I can put this. Coming from the eye, we have the optic nerve, and it's going to form an optic, it's going to cross over and form an optic tract, and then that's going to come back to each side, and form one of the nuclei of the brain. So what happens is, I'm going to draw this over here a little bit smaller. Here is the retina of one eye and the retina of another. We're looking down on top of the brain. This is more for clarification of the geniculate nuclei than the optic pathway itself, which we will cover when we do the eye. So when we look at the inferior surface of the brain, as we saw on that brain that the woman was holding at the beginning of class in the movie, we see the optic nerves. You can kind of see that X. And then the optic tract is going to go back to the thalamus. And that part of the thalamus that it goes back to is the lateral geniculate nucleus. So, we have photoreceptors. for color or just different degrees of light. We have our first order neuron. Remember I said bipolar neurons were found in the eye and the nose? So this would be our first neuron. The second neuron passes through the optic nerve. Some of them will cross over, some of them will go straight, depends on which side of the retina they're on, and will go to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. So I want you to recognize that as being for vision. It's coming from the eye. And then from here, it's going to go to the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe to be processed as an image. So it has the same 1, 2, 3 neurons that we will go over a week from today when we do our sensory pathways. And these third order neurons are in the thalamus. That's what makes up most of the thalamus. It's gray matter, which are the cell bodies of the third neuron in all of our sensory pathways. So if I pinch my finger, and I'm doing that right now, so I'm getting a tiny little bit of pain. I'm not masochistic, but I get a tiny little bit of pain that's going up to the third, my thalamus, synapsing with the third neuron in that pathway, and that's going to my post-central gyrus, for the area along the homunculus of my, wherever the hand is, and then it's being recognized and processed as pain. So that's what makes up the bulk of most of the thalamic nuclei. Okay? And that's what I want you to, lateral is visual and medial geniculate is auditory. And then the subthalamic nucleus, just recognize it as part of the basal nuclei. Okay. So with these charts here, again, it's there's more detail on there than I'm asking you to be able to repeat back to me or that I would test you on. But that's specifically what I would want you to know. Lateral, medial, recognize subthalamic as basal nuclei. So now let's do, any questions on that?
Say lateral vision.
The only sensory stimuli that doesn't go through the thalamus is smell. That says it says it right here. Smell does not go through the thalamus. So this is a model that we find by itself, partly in your in the brains. We have a couple that are over there, I think, all by themselves, or that is found with this. So here's the thalamus, right here, on the medial view. This is it on the posterior view. So this would be the pulvinar, this large portion in the back of the thalamus. Okay. And I just repeat that, it's shown this part right here. So this is an anterior view of the brainstem. This would be the insula out here on the side. So what you're seeing here, this is the insula. We're going to have a camera to pose for. All right, so that's the insula, and then this is the medial view with the big swelling of the pons and the pituitary gland and the optic nerves. And if you turn it over in the back, this is the pulvinar. So that's the posterior portion that you're seeing of the thalamus. Okay, now let's move to hypothalamus. So here's the thalamus. This picture almost looks like, I don't know, painted up motorcycle or something. Here, this is the thalamus here. So these are nuclei of the hypothalamus. All right? And while they do have names, we won't learn any of them until next semester. A couple of them release, well, they're neurotransmitters, except they don't go into another nerve, they go into the blood. So they really are hormones. You may have heard of oxytocin. Okay, that comes from the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland, which here would be hypothalamus, it sends, as it's developing, it sends out to the eye and forms the optic nerve. And then it sends down part of what is going to be the pituitary from the roof of the mouth, and this is for free. The rest of the pituitary develops. And then we have our mammillary bodies, right? And here would be thalamus. And this is hypothalamus. In addition to just these components, the rest of the nuclei are involved with a great variety of functions. Sometimes I put two in, but sometimes I don't. I never can remember which I put. But anyway, so first of all, in addition to those hormones, it regulates the pituitary gland. You've probably heard of negative feedback. We talked about it at the very beginning of class. So if you are a female, all right, and your estrogen levels are towards the end of the estrogen cycle and the estrogen levels are falling, then in response to that, the hypothalamus will release chemicals that travel in the blood to the anterior pituitary and trigger it to release LSH and FSH that make the ovaries release, and the testes for that matter, as testosterone levels rise and fall. That affects the hypothalamus, regulates the hormones that make those components. Thyroid hormone. You guys have probably heard of the thyroid gland and the thyroid hormone. All right, if you don't have enough iodine in your diet and you're not making enough active thyroid hormone, the hypothalamus will make thyroid stimulating hormone that will go to the anterior pituitary and trigger it to make more thyroid releasing hormone that go to the anterior pituitary to make it make more thyroid stimulating hormone. This is how goiters develop. This is for free. So someone who doesn't have enough iodine in their diet, the hormone that they do make is inactive, and the body acts as if it's not making enough. So the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to make more thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid gland gets bigger as it keeps trying to make more and more hormone, and that's what a goiter is. So my point in all that is the hypothalamus actually controls the pituitary, okay, in addition to making two of its own hormones. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. We're talking about the fight or flight. At the very beginning of the nervous system, we talked about the voluntary and involuntary. And so while the voluntary is controlled by our precentral gyrus and premotor cortex and basal nuclei, the involuntary is a little bit more vague. But the hypothalamus has a great deal of regulation of the involuntary. We're going to do the limbic system for emotions, but certain emotions are affected by the hypothalamus. So rage and aggression can damage to the hypothalamus, can increase the expression of those emotions. There are temperature receptors in the hypothalamus. So it can set what your body temperature responds to, how cold you get before you start to shiver, all right? Or how warm you get before your blood vessels dilate. So setting the temperature, setting your metabolic rate is part of the hypothalamus, how much ATP your body requires. Fullness. So the stretch receptors, when you eat a lot, your stomach stretches, that sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which sends a signal that you're full and you don't need to eat anymore. For some of us, that gets a little bit delayed. We've already been eating over an hour after we're full before we start to feel full. Also the level of glucose in the blood. So as glucose levels rise, that tells the hypothalamus, hey, there's nutrients in the blood, and it sends a signal that you're full. Same thing for thirst. So depending on the number of sodium ion concentrations in the blood. If those are really high, your hypothalamus sends a signal that you are feeling thirsty. You can help to alleviate that by just holding a mouthful of water Not swallow it, because that's not going to do anything to change. 1 tablespoon of water is not going to do much to change the overall concentration of sodium ions in your body. But if you just hold it in your mouth, you can trick the hypothalamus into thinking that you have enough water. Doesn't save your body from being dehydrated, but at least you don't have that overwhelming sense of thirst when you have nothing to drink for a while. So there's this great variety of functions for the hypothalamus, and I have those listed there on page 80. These wake cycles are also seen with our next, the major function of the pineal gland, which is the roof, so it's opposite end of the pituitary. So in the posterior aspect here, we see this structure. We're going to see it next Thursday. It's quite large in the shape, about the size of a large pea. That we can see when we separate the occipital lobes from each other. We can look down in there just above the midbrain. So here's the midbrain. Here's the cerebral aqueduct. Here's the midbrain, and just right above that is the pineal gland. Now, some of our models show it in sagittal section, and some don't show it quite as well. So that's diencephalon. Okay, recognize pituitary, optic nerve, pineal gland, hypothalamus, thalamus, third ventricle, all of those structures as being components of the diencephalon. And that brings us to another vague area of what do I need to know and what don't I need to know. This has a lot of interesting damages to the limbic system, have a lot of interesting effects on the body. I'll go through some of these, but I'm not going to test you on lecture exams to specifics. I believe, and I'll have to go double check, I told the morning class I would check this afternoon. The quiz on this is extra credit because it's vague on what we have. Okay, it is extra credit? Okay, so I'll do several, and it's fun. I mean, all the things that are changed, we always kind of look at someone that's behaving rather weirdly and like, well, I'm glad I'm not that person. But then you can start to understand some of the changes that they go through. When I was looking for the video to show you of the hemiglossmus, I didn't watch it, there was just the label of it there, a woman who had been scuba diving and got a bad tank of air and developed damage to her basal nuclei and was demonstrating some of the problems with that. Limbic means rim. So it's a rim of structures, many of which belong to the prosencephalon, everything that's listed here, but some people include structures that belong to the brainstem. And so these structures rim around the basal nuclei. Cingulate gyrus we already talked about, all right? And hippocampus becomes part of this. Mammillary body, we talked hippocampus and mammillary body we talked about with memory. So let's kind of look through. This is where it's called the emotional. It has to do with our interactions, social interactions with people, facial recognition as far as what it means, not just recognizing a face for a face, but what do we interpret. So truthfulness, when we talk to somebody and we decide whether they're telling us the truth or not. Those types of things can come from the limbic system. So this is just showing parts of it here with the hippocampus and the fornix and part of some other structures. So amygdala I haven't talked about very detailed. I did mention the hippocampus, so I want to come back to this model. We'll be making it on Tuesday. Remember I said the hippocampus was part of the temporal lobe, that seahorse kind of gray matter that we find in the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. That's gray matter. Okay, so I'm putting it here in the floor of the inferior horn. And then white matter from the hippocampus. So here's the hippocampus, and we'll see this really well in our sheep brain. White matter from the hippocampus comes up and forms a column known as the fornix. And the fornix crosses over the thalamus, down lateral to the hypothalamus, and ends in the hypothalamus at these mammillary bodies. So I don't know if you remember in that brain at the beginning, she was pointing out those 2 bumps posterior to the pituitary gland. So here is the, take this off. So this blue, and I'll walk it around again, this blue is the hippocampus, all right? The fornix arises from the axons or processes of all those gray matter. It comes around over the thalamus. Gotta make this a little bit longer here. It's shortened on me. Comes over the thalamus. They come together and then slightly comes down into the mammillary body. So that's one structure I'm going to show you. The fornix coming off the hippocampus and ending in the mammillary body. And the other structure is the amygdala, which is found as the kind of front wall, if you will, of the inferior horn. So if I'm the hippocampus, what I butt my head up against is going to be that amygdala, okay? So the deep blue is the hippocampus, ending in the amygdala, and the white is the white matter carrying information from the hippocampus to the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. Okay, so everything again is still in a C shape.
In front of that, is that the amygdala?
Yeah, the front of the hippocampus is the amygdala. Okay, so amygdala, hippocampus, fornix to mammillary body. Okay, hippocampus, amygdala, hippocampus, fornix coming off the hippocampus, going over the thalamus and ending in the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. For you three, here's the hippocampus forming the floor of the inferior horn, amygdala. White matter axons coming off the hippocampus, going over the thalamus to the hypothalamus, and ending in the mammillary body. And we do that circuitry we talked about for short-term memory from the hippocampus to the mammillary body. So here's the hippocampus, the floor of the inferior horn, top down here at the front by the amygdala, and then white matter comes off of that, forming the fornix over the top of the thalamus and ending in the hypothalamus as the mammillary body. So you can see that happening there on that diagram. All those structures are shown on that diagram. So hippocampus, you're in the floor of the inferior horn, amygdala at the very front, the front wall of the inferior horn. And then white matter comes off the hippocampus, goes over the thalamus, lateral to the hypothalamus, and into the mammillary body. So we send a kind of resurfacing of information back and forth between the hippocampus and the mammillary body to form short-term memory. All right, so the amygdala, recognition of fear and anger, assesses the level of danger, elicits fear responses. So let's say, and I don't know, maybe some people just crave adrenaline rushes.
Yes.
And they climb sheer rock faces with no additional help, no ropes or anything. They climb Mount Everest without oxygen. I wouldn't go so far as to say they jump off airplanes without parachutes, but you wonder, and they just have to have this or they don't feel alive. So I don't know if there's an actual damage to their amygdala. I've read that children, babies, develop a sense of danger, so they know they'll be afraid to do things. Sometimes there's a danger fear, and some kids have it and some kids don't. A fear of strangeness. And when kids are infants, they don't have a sense of depth, all right? There's been tests that have been done by behavioral psychologists that will take a table and put a strong piece of tempered glass or plexiglass over it, and the baby will just crawl right over it. But as it gets older, it can sense that there's something down there, and they don't know whether that glass will hold them. And this was really illustrated to me. I was at my husband's old office, and the lobby of the marble floor was white, but right between the banks of elevators, it was black. And it was this highly polished black. and this dad had come in with his 2 or 3-year-old, and had walked ahead of the kid, and the kid was really cute, so I turned to watch, and I was with my husband. And so the dad walks to the elevator, and they started to push the button, and the kid, it was so funny, he just walks right up to it and stops as soon as he gets to the black marble. And even though the dad was standing on it and calling him, he would not walk over there to his dad. It was like, you might walk on water, Dad, but I'm not gonna walk on the unknown. His dad had to actually come over him and pick him up and take him over to the elevator. So again, I don't know if that was a manifestation of